Once again, welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We have a great lineup for you this week, and we're going to start off with Xizi Daigle, who joins us from rainy London. How are you today?
There you go. I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on again.
For people who are meeting you for the first time, let's take just a moment here and ask you to just tell a little bit about yourself, and then we have a wonderful topic we're going to dive into.
My name's Xizi Daigle. I just completed my Master of Public Administration at the London School of Economics. So I'm based in the UK, but I'm originally Canadian, and I've worked on refugee and migration issues, both in Canada and internationally. So this topic is close to my heart.
Well, yeah, immigration is on a lot of people's minds, and I don't always hear a lot of positive commentary that goes along with it, but I think the article that you've written here for financialpost.com is actually one of the more positive aspects that I've seen in a while. And the title here is that refugee sponsorship could help with immigration woes. Now, specifically, we're talking about Canada, but let's talk a little bit, first of all, about where is the situation in Canada right now? What are they feeling in terms of immigration pressures and so forth?
Yeah, so Canada has been historically a very tolerant community country when it comes to immigration topics, when it comes to asylum seekers. And we're seeing a shift in that attitude. So an IRCC survey, IRCC being the Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, so our Ministry of Immigration, came out with a survey in 2024 at the start of this year. And this is an annual survey, but this year they found that the number of people responding that the number of immigrants coming to Canada is too many. The respondents for that is the highest level it's been at for 20 years. So 35% of Canadians agree that the number of immigrants coming to Canada is too high. So more than a third. So growing up in Canada, I was always taught, as an immigrant myself, of Canada's sort of diverse cultural mosaic model, an approach to immigration in which everybody brings their own culture. So a colorful tile to the cultural mosaic, if you would have it. And this is something that we contrast, sometimes to our neighbors down south, where there's a melting pot. Immigrants and refugees are encouraged to assimilate to American culture as much as possible. And actually in Canada right now, a big conversation when it comes to immigration, and also specifically refugees, is the ability for refugees to integrate. So an Ipsos survey, a market research survey, has also seen that Canadians have a decreased confidence in refugees' ability to integrate. And this sort of Canadians' lack of confidence in refugees' inability to integrate, as well as our faith that immigration is too high, it comes really down to the idea that there's no absorptive capacity, if you will, anymore for refugees and immigrants. So a lot of newcomers are coming and competing with Canadians for housing and public services like healthcare and education. So if you take a look at the context in Canada, historically very tolerant. This has been put in place by the elder Trudeau. Trudeau's the current prime minister's father. So our immigration policy has been very open, but more and more recently, because of inflationary pressures, we see cultural clashes with newcomers. This attitude is changing in Canada.
I like in your article how you point out that part of the problem here is that there's a top-down system in which all the decision-making is taking place, above the populace. And you say that instead of letting those quotas as to how many people can come in be determined at the top, the Canadians themselves need to have more of a direct say in how many refugees to accept. Talk to me about how that might work, and specifically how sponsorship could play a role in making that a reality.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Brian. So we're looking at historically very high levels of quotas for both permanent residents and temporary residents. What my article focuses on is the refugee contribution to that permanent residency quota. So permanent residents, if you think about the sort of pipeline that immigrants take to become a Canadian citizen, most immigrants arrive as economic migrants. They come as temporary residents, work a few years under employee sponsorship. They might gain permanent residency and then eventually get citizenship, and then all of the benefits that come with that, like the right to vote. Now, when it comes to refugees that are resettled from abroad, so This is specifically refugees that, are applying for asylum to Canada from their home country, rather than the irregular ones arriving perhaps, on the US Canadian border. We're talking about the refugees that come from abroad. They actually get to bystep that first process of temporary residence. They come here immediately as permanent residents, and they get eligibility for Canadian Medicare, and other government benefits. So some Canadians are saying this is an unfair process. Others are saying this actually adds competition to a lot of woes caused by immigration right now. Canadian young people, including myself, even college students who are looking for summer jobs, looking to have housing, it's become quite a big issue just domestically. So any sort of increase in immigration, whether it be refugees or other economic migrants, just adds to that sort of pressure, that competitive pressure. So a solution to that is this sort of bottom-up approach that we call community-led or private refugee sponsorship, in which members of a community or a civil society organization or even employers come together and sponsor a refugee for resettlement in Canada, paying for their fees for their first year. So that could include rent, startup costs like furniture, clothing, instead of having the government do that. And in this way, communities have a say in how much they believe they can contribute to refugees. This doesn't come from taxpayer money. It comes from private individuals' own purse and their willingness to sponsor refugees based on how they see the public services in their own communities. So this is very much empowering ordinary Canadians and employers to sponsor refugees into their own communities and live side by side with these refugees and contribute to these refugees' integration as well.
I like that it puts it in the hands of the citizens to a degree. So tell me, are there people basically standing in line saying, yes, I would sponsor people and I would be happy, to help ease that burden on, the public purse in order to let this person come and be a part of our country?
So like I mentioned earlier, Canadians feel a lot of inflationary pressure, and sponsor groups are not exempt from that. So we actually see that sponsor groups, civil society organizations that help sponsor groups, see that there has been less interest in recent waves of refugees. So there's been less interest, for example, in sponsoring Ukrainian or Afghan refugees compared to Syrian ones even a few years ago. And that's just because of the inflationary pressures and rise of cost of living and supply side issues that Canadians face themselves. So there is willingness, there is political willpower, but Canadians are being restrained by economic forces, which makes sponsorship actually a very sustainable refugee resettlement method. Communities can say to themselves, can we ourselves take care of ourselves first before we let others in? Even if those others could be family members or familiar faces to us, it really puts Canadians at the center of refugee resettlement.
And I know you point this out in your article, but this private refugee sponsorship would actually be a great way for that legendary Canadian kindness, to be put to good work.
That's right.
And ensure that people are welcome. I see this as a very positive thing that you're recommending here, just because there seems to be so much anti-immigration sentiment, throughout the Western world.
Absolutely. And so with refugee sponsorship, I just see it as sort of like a win-win-win solution. It helps the government, it helps local Canadians, it also helps refugees. Everyone benefits from it. Like Canadians, it reduces the competition for housing and public services. It strengthens the social fabric because refugees who come here who are sponsored, they have existing community ties, or they can offer skills to Canadian employers. Furthermore, it helps refugees with integration. So sponsored refugees have higher labor market participation, outcomes, language acquisitions faster, and they also have more civic participation, feeling like they're a big part of Canada, and feeling this gratitude towards their hosts and their ability to be a part of a community. That's what makes private sponsorship so powerful. Beyond the economic considerations, it just strengthens the social fabric.
Again, we are talking with Xizi Daigle. Thank you so much for shining some light on this subject. For people who want to follow you on social media, what's the best way to do that?
They can reach me on LinkedIn or find the article on Postmedia, including Postmedia's local papers across Canada. Thank you.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Peter Biles back to the program. He is a Young Voices contributor. And Peter, take a moment here to tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure thing. So I am a writer from Oklahoma, and I write a lot of primarily fiction, but I also do cultural commentary. I write a lot about technology and culture, specifically social media, and I'm also interested in writing on movies and TV shows and books and that sort of thing as well. I also teach adjunct classes here at OBU in Shawnee, Oklahoma. And that about sums it up.
All right. I love the article that I received. That you've written this. This is published in the American Spectator. The Rings of Power has Chat GPT syndrome. And I have not seen, I've not yet watched the Rings of Power, but I gather every time I go on, to watch streaming television, there's always, something big playing up about this. Talk to me, first of all, a little bit about the series. The Lord of the Rings, that's a pretty tough act to follow, the theatrical releases, but talk to me about this latest addition to the Lord of Rings. What's the story behind it?
Sure. So from my understanding, Amazon bought the partial rights to the Tolkien universe. So I believe they're drawing from the appendices of the Lord of the Rings novel, which can be found at the end of The Return of the King. So from my understanding, they're drawing from sort of the background history of Middle-earth, particularly sort of the rise of Sauron, who's the primary villain in the Lord of the Rings narrative. So the story is sort of Sauron's deception of primarily the elves into crafting the rings of power, which he in the book, it's mentioned that he gives these rings as gifts to the different groups of people or persons in Middle-earth, including men, dwarves, and elves. So the story is sort of mainly about Sauron's rise, but through sort of deception and getting into the inner ranks of the elves and pretending to be someone he's not. And then there's a ton of other storylines too that I don't think they needed to add. That seemed kind of superfluous, but from what I've watched, that's sort of the main linchpin of the show.
Specifically, though, in this article, you are taking to task some of the dialogue that takes place, and I think you make a very strong case. Tolkien himself would probably be like, "What? What's going on here?" Explain what are they doing in terms of the dialogue that makes it sound like they let Chat GPT take a crack at it.
Yeah, so it took me a while to kind of figure out the main issue with the dialogue, but I think, I think in a large part they're trying to replicate sort of the grandeur of Peter Jackson's film trilogy, which came out, some 20 years ago, and it still is really, really impressive, visually, thematically. And so you kind of see that across the board. I think with the dialogue specifically, I don't think they had much to go off of with the appendices as far as subject material. And so they're having to kind of make all this dialogue up. So I think the main problem with the dialogue is that they're trying to sound like Tolkien, sort of this grand, beautiful, sort of majestic manner. But it ends up sounding kind of grandstanding and moralizing and just, it's without substance. It's long-winded in most cases. And so I think I see this a lot in fiction and novels where the writer is trying to sound overly serious with the dialogue or with the description, and it ends up kind of falling flat and not really delivering on like a real message, or the message could be communicated in about 25% of the of the space. So that's the main issue I thought I have with the dialogue. And I think it's a problem. It spans out broader than that, but yeah.
You actually have, I think, some wonderful examples in your article. Maybe you could share a couple of those with us to illustrate what you're talking about here.
Right. Yeah. Let me see if I can remember. There's one. I think Galadriel says, he played me like a harp, but the melody was not of my choosing. There's another one spoken by the Elvish leader Gil-Galad. He says something like sparks drifting from the fire, we have drifted too far from our home. So there's a lot of weird and kind of forced mixed metaphors that don't really they just seem kind of unnatural and not really creative. So that's sort of the a couple of examples but they're, the show is rife with these one-liners that are again trying to sound like Tolkien, but are just not really cutting the bill.
No, the examples you give there, I think, are really good. And as you pointed out, that first quote about, he played me like a harp, but the tune was not of my choosing. I was deceived. Could have very well summed it up, and
exactly
conveyed the same message. But I guess, now this is to Tolkien's credit. The man was really one of a kind. And so it should probably be considered, kind of a compliment that it's very hard to duplicate him. But talk to me about what that does to the audience when we have to labor through long-winded, dialogue like this. How does that harm the telling of the story?
I think the primary problem with it is that it distracts us from the story, and it doesn't supplement or add to it. So with dialogue, it seems like the dialogue is very self-conscious of trying to sound a certain way, and so it ends up sort of calling too much attention to himself and sort of seamlessly joining itself with the broader narrative. And I think really good dialogue does that well. It's able to be right. It's able to be placed appropriately and right where you need it when you need it. And I don't really get the sense that the dialogue is placed that well or is timed that well in the show. And I think it doesn't really seem to reflect the characters very well. I think dialogue obviously is an expression of character, and I just don't get the sense that these are Tolkien's inventions. They seem to depart pretty heavily from my understanding of Tolkien's characters. They just don't seem to be the complex or the really the virtuous. I think there's something missing with the virtue in these characters, and a lot of them just aren't that likable either, in my opinion. So I think that's what I would say, that it sort of distracts, but it also doesn't reflect, I think, the essence of these characters in a good way.
So I have to ask you this, and I'm not trying to be unkind to the writers, but were they given an impossible task to try to duplicate Tolkien's feel?
I think, like you said, it's a tall order to fulfill, because Tolkien was a literary genius. He was a linguist and philologist, and he invented these languages to sort of serve as the foundation of his world. And so I do think it's a tall task, especially when you don't have the source material to go off of, like Peter Jackson did. He was able to draw off the actual dialogue that Tolkien wrote. So yes, I will give that to the writers. I think I would feel in a similar position. Trying to sound like Tolkien is difficult, but I think they should have focused more on what did the Tolkien mean and what was his intention, what was the world he was actually trying to invent like. And I think they should have focused more on the meaning of his world instead of the sound of it.
I like that at the end of the article that you recommend, you still have the option if you want to read Tolkien. That's one way to do it. And maybe that's the best way to kind of get a feel for, well, what really was he trying to convey? Well, let's go to the source. And, people who do that are going to have a lot easier time judging whether did they come close or did they miss this one by a mile. Sounds like you've done your share of reading Tolkien.
Yes, that's always an option, just to go back and read Tolkien himself. It's probably what he would have intended anyway.
So as far as compared to, the Peter Jackson movies, like you mentioned earlier, those are masterpieces in and of themselves. Does the new Amazon series, does it come close in terms of the cinematic features, or are they relying too much on, computer generated things?
It comes close at times, I think. The city of Numenor is really beautifully done in the show, and they put $1 billion into this project. So you'd expect that across the board it would be impressive. But overall, I think it doesn't quite match the majesty of Peter Jackson, even though it's all that much newer.
Okay, again, we are talking with Peter Biles. Peter is a Young Voices contributor, and thank you again so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We're happy to welcome a new contributor to today's program. Oscar Gill-Lewis joins us. Oscar, pleasure to make your acquaintance. Take a moment and tell us just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
A pleasure to be on the show, Brian. My name is Oscar Gill-Lewis. I'm an editor for Speak Freely magazine, and I'm a Young Voices contributor.
Very good. And today we're going to be talking about an article that you've written for Reaction.life. Robust procurement rules are key to avoiding a repeat of the post office scandal. And I have to admit, I am not familiar with the post office scandal. Can you set the stage for me about what that entails?
Absolutely, it'd be my pleasure. So basically, since 1999, Fujitsu is a technology company, and they took over the accounting system for the post office in the United Kingdom. And basically, they made this accounting system called Horizon, and they put terminals in all the post offices across the United Kingdom. And what has happened is that there's been a post office inquiry that has found bugs, errors, and defects in a lot of these machines and in the system in general, which has affected hundreds and hundreds of sub-postmasters, which are people who run individual post offices. And this has led to people being convicted and being imprisoned and extorted for money from the post office.
And I know you point out in your article, not everyone who was accused actually was guilty.
That's correct. A large majority of them, I'd almost go as far to say is that almost none of them were guilty. You can't be sure with these large numbers. I don't know every single case, but if you look at it on paper, one day most of your workforce is completely compliant, nice, local people, very trustworthy. And then overnight, 1 in 12 of your employees is taking money out of the pot. It doesn't seem quite right, which is where the problems with the system comes in, not the people.
Wow. That is so sad. You mentioned too that this has devastating consequences for those who have been accused of stealing. Talk to me about the system itself. For something that's been in place for so long, since 1999, why weren't the problems caught and fixed? How does a problem stay in place for so long?
Well, it's a really interesting aspect of this scandal. So originally in 1996, Fujitsu weren't the original company who instituted the system, but they took over in 1999 from a system in 1996 to save public face because a lot of money had been put into the original system in 96. Part of the whole purpose of my article was to point out that basically procurement policy has allowed these scandals to extend over 20 plus years and devastated hundreds of lives because there's very little. The procurement policies have made it easy for Fujitsu to gain more contracts with the post office. And the post office and Fujitsu have almost entered into a Faustian bargain where their survival depends on each other, where the post office has tried to, in its attempt to protect its own reputation, has forced itself into protecting Fujitsu's reputation, because that's the biggest thing that the post office prides itself on. Something that the former CEO Paula Venables always talked about was the post office's stellar 350-year reputation, and by wanting to protect that, it's had to protect a well-known poor organization like Fujitsu that has not only had errors working with the post office but also with other government agencies.
Wow, you would think that somewhere along the line someone would say, okay, Fujitsu, we've had enough mistakes and it's time to give someone else a chance. It makes me wonder how they continue to keep landing contracts in spite of a spotty track record.
Yes, absolutely. So part of the procurement policy is that in previous generations of the procurement policy, there was you could stop people getting or companies from getting contracts again through poor performance, but the scope wasn't wide enough. So now with this new policy that's coming into law in the next year or two, we should see a greater scope for prohibiting renewal of contracts or giving out contracts due to poor performance. But part of the problem is that Fujitsu was such a big company that it was able to hide poor performance and show examples of good work that it's done in the past, and was able to circumscribe the previous procurement laws.
So it sounds like the steps are being taken, but it takes a little while to get those pieces in place to correct the problem.
Yes, I don't believe it would be an immediate fix. And also, one of the shocking things is that Fujitsu have recently renewed their contract earlier this year with the post office.
Wow. I'm sure there's a story behind that as well. You mentioned that there's a debarment list that can come into play. What does it take for a company to land itself on the debarment list?
So obviously, I think this is one of the things that the government is still working out the details of. But one of the things would be a lot of what Fujitsu has done, which is caused these sub-postmasters to suffer horribly through its own errors and mistakes. Basically, it would just be poor performance, but it could also be damages. So defrauding, or anything in that sort of vein, anything where it goes beyond just not doing your job properly. It goes beyond it goes into the area of actually being corporate malpractice.
Now, as far as those postmasters who were accused of theft and pushed, to suicide, or who otherwise have really, they've been done wrong, do they have any kind of recourse in terms of restoring their reputation or restoring themselves financially or professionally?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So the post office right now is attempting to pay back these sub-postmasters. So part of the problem is that these sub-postmasters need financial redress and compensation. A lot of the discussion at the minute confuses the two terms. So they do offer some schemes, but it's such a shame because the post office is trying to escape out of paying the sub-postmasters certain compensation by offering them short-term pay, so short amounts of, let's say, the total compensation that the post office, that sub-postmasters could earn is up to 75,000 in some schemes. And what the post office is doing is sending letters to individual sub-postmasters, offering them 15,000, and then that's it. They wouldn't pay them any more, just as a way to try and squeeze out of it.
Wow. So I have to ask this. We have about a minute left, but Oscar, is the post office in the UK facing some of the same technological challenges and competition that the post office in the United States is facing? I mean, the Postal Service, there was a time where that was the primary way that we, sent messages, packages, and so forth, but we have many, many other options. Is there a similar situation there in the UK?
Absolutely. One of the big discussions at the minute is that we sell off the post office to Amazon for £1. It's very interesting that in the post office inquiry, the former CEO Paula Reynolds accidentally let out that email would have been more efficient than sending a letter. So it's definitely facing the same technological issues, and it's running out of time, I think.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to shine the light, especially on those who may have suffered wrongdoing, and hopefully the Procurement Act and the reforms that will be taking place will be enough to help correct some of that. Tell people where they can find you on social media, where they can follow your writing.
You can find me on LinkedIn, Oscar Gill-Lewis, GILL-LEWIS, and you can also find my work on wespeakfreely.org.
Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Bryan. It's a pleasure.
Welcome back. This is our fourth and final segment today on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome back to the program Harris Van Pate, joining us from the great state of Maine. How are you today, Harris?
I'm doing great, Brian. It's a wonderful fall in Maine.
Tell us a little bit about yourself for the sake of those meeting you for the first time.
Sure. My background is in public policy and legal policy at the state and federal level. I have a bachelor's degree in political policy from Michigan State and a law degree from Florida State University. I'm currently a policy analyst at Maine Policy Institute, and I'm also an adjunct research fellow at the Free State Foundation based out of Maryland.
Sounds like you keep busy.
That I do.
Okay.
That I do.
Let's talk about President Biden's proposal to impose term limits on the Supreme Court. I know the Supreme Court's kind of a touchy subject, depending on whose way they have ruled recently, and it seems like there has been a pretty good stream of victories that have not gone necessarily in the direction of the Democrats. But talk to me about, why did Biden propose this Supreme Court term limit, and what exactly would it consist of?
Sure. Biden proposed this term limit back in July, and it occurred very quickly after he dropped out of his candidacy for re-election. I suspect it's because he realizes that this is going to be very unpopular policy proposal with more politically independent people, because this is going to directly politicize the Supreme Court. He gave a speech on July 29th at the LBJ National Library in Austin, Texas. And he said that he was very concerned about the increasing political extremism on the court. And he claimed that the current Supreme Court is being very dismissive of voting rights. And he felt that imposing an 18-year term on Supreme Court justices, where at that point they would be replaced by the normal presidential nominee with Senate approval method, would be a better way to avoid these problems, as opposed to the current life tenure system that we use for Supreme Court members.
So is it a good idea to make justices more responsive to public opinion? Because it seems like that can change really quickly.
This is something that Biden did not come up with this from his masterful political mind. This is something that has been discussed for a long, long time. And a lot of other Western countries do have much shorter term limits. I believe America might be the only one that has lifetime tenure for Supreme Court justices, at least the only Western country, though where that border is kind of flimsy. In short, it is not a good idea. Currently, Biden is proposing this, and possibly a future President Harris might support this as well, because the Supreme Court is supporting a lot of policies that they do not personally agree with, that strikes against a lot of their political agenda. The issue is that this would have a large amount of negative effects on the court, not only politicization of the court, but it would remove the more experienced members from the court. It would remove members who have finally, after a long time, understood their role in the federal legal system, and because it takes a long time to get a grasp on how important the Supreme Court is in protecting constitutional rights from any level of government violating them. They are where the buck stops with them when it comes to constitutional issues. So it is very important that the justices in the court understand what they're doing.
So let me ask you this. You mentioned in your article that those term limits would have deprived the court of some of the key justices, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Connor or Kennedy, that actually were part of very pivotal decisions of late. And maybe we could walk through a couple of the examples of what are the long-term effects that imposing term limits might have on upcoming Supreme Court justices.
Absolutely. With Justice Ginsburg, she's thought of as a more left-leaning justice, and I use her as a primary example in my article, where Justice Ginsburg, while she was thought of as a more left-leaning justice, she was also thought of as a very preeminent legal mind. She was very good friends with Justice Scalia. She was not necessarily someone. She wasn't this sort of AOC, very political figure who prioritizes policy over right and wrong, over legal principles. And if we look at some of her Supreme Court rulings, we can see that they are very pivotal in establishing what we consider major legal rights in regardless of where you lie on the political spectrum. And the issue is that if you look at Justice Ginsburg's tenure on the court, she was appointed by President Clinton in 1993, which makes her 18th year 2011, which means, and she stayed on the court till her death in 2020. So her last 9 years on the court, if Biden's proposal was in place, would never have happened. And sure, she would have left the court during Obama's tenure, so she might have been likely replaced by another left-leaning justice. But she wasn't just any left-leaning Supreme Court justice. She was as I said, a major political mind. She was one of the deciding votes in Obergefell v. Hodges, which is the 2015 case securing the federal right to same-sex marriage. That case was authored by, I believe, Justice Kennedy, who was on his 27th year on the court at that point. If either of those justices weren't on the court, we very well might not have had same-sex marriage legalized in 2015. And regardless, again, how you feel, that is what many people, especially nowadays, consider a pretty non-controversial right. We don't have, for example, President Trump running on removing that. We also have Ginsburg issued several major opinions on voting rights, much to against what Biden claims would happen if we kept this policy. She affirmed that she issued several rulings on racial gerrymandering, on political gerrymandering. Justice Ginsburg's presence on the court during those last 9 years of her tenure were absolutely foundational to many rights that, regardless of your political stance, are crucial. And regardless, our legal system would be far worse off without her in those last 9 years, in my view.
Well, the message that comes through loud and clear is that it's really important we don't allow the court to become politicized. And I think you make a very strong case that, this is a good way to politicize it, is, limit the term limits on there. I mean, look, if somebody engages in bad behavior, I believe they can be impeached or they can be removed. But otherwise, this is probably one of the most stable branches of government that we have in the country.
Exactly. We do have a process for the Constitution says Supreme Court members can they serve during good behavior. So if the justice objectively behaves poorly, if they do something absolutely abhorrent in either their rulings or something that shows they're incredibly corrupt or unprofessional in their personal life or professional life, the Senate can remove them. They have an impeachment process similar to the president, which we have seen used in a much more active way. So if there really truly was such a corruption problem in the court, we would see the Senate using it. But they're not, because there simply isn't. And this very well could cause more political controversy in the court in the future if this policy was put in place.
Once again, we are talking with Harris Van Pate. He is a Young Voices contributor. And Harris, for people who want to follow you on social media or follow your writings, what's the best place to find you?
I can be found primarily on the Main Policy website. I'm a contributing author with Young Voices, and I am primarily on the Main Policy website.